The mountains of Vaeltha's prime were not kind to anything that tried to live on them. The rocks were sharp. The wind was cold and mean. The sky above was a pale, sick green that never fully turned blue, even at midday. It was the kind of place where only people with no better options ever ended up. Sergeant Marcus Hale had no better options. He sat at the back of a slow-moving armored transport, his rifle across his knees, his eyes watching the ridgeline above the mountain road. He was 34 years old, built like someone who had spent years carrying heavy things through hard places, with short dark hair going gray at the sides and a jaw that always looked like it needed a shave. His hands were rough, his boots were old, and his eyes, pale gray, quiet, were always moving, always watching, always counting. The transport carried 7 people total, Marcus and 5 other human soldiers from the Terran Expeditionary Corps, plus 1 alien. The alien sat on the opposite bench and had not spoken a single word to any of them since they left the base camp 4 hours ago. Her name was Saravel. She was the 3rd daughter of Queen Velsera of the Ketharan Dominion, which made her a princess, which in theory meant everyone in this transport was supposed to treat her with a certain level of respect and care. In practice, she treated all of them like furniture, not with cruelty, just with the casual indifference of someone who had grown up surrounded by servants and never really learned how to look at a common person like they were fully real. She was tall, even sitting down. The Ketharan were always tall, long-limbed and slender, with smooth skin the color of pale blue-gray stone, large dark eyes that had no whites to them, and facial features that were sharp and almost geometric. Saravel wore traveling clothes, not royal robes, but even her traveling clothes were made from fabric that probably cost more than Marcus earned in a year. Her dark hair was tied back simply. She was young, maybe 20 in human terms, though alien age was always hard to guess. She was watching the mountains through the small window, with a look that suggested she found all of this mildly beneath her. Marcus had been watching her as much as he had been watching the ridgeline, not because she interested him in any personal way, but because she was the mission. The Terran Expeditionary Corps had been attached to the Ketharan diplomatic convoy as auxiliary security. The official term was Allied Support Personnel. The unofficial term, the one the soldiers used quietly among themselves, was expendable escort. The Ketharan didn't think much of humans. That wasn't a secret. They were polite about it, mostly, careful, diplomatic, never saying anything openly rude, but it was there in every interaction. The slight pause before answering a human's question. The way Ketharan officers explained things slowly, as if the humans might not understand. The way Commander Reichsful, who led the princess's royal guard and rode in the transport ahead of theirs, had introduced Marcus's squad to the convoy coordinator as the human attaché, without bothering to use any of their names. Marcus had been in the Corps long enough not to care about slights. What he cared about was the mission, and right now the mission was getting Princess Saravel safely through these mountains to the diplomatic meeting point at the valley station on the other side. The convoy was 3 vehicles, Reichsful's command transport in the front, the princess's transport, Marcus's transport in the middle, a supply vehicle at the back, 12 Ketharan royal guards total, plus Marcus's 6, 19 armed fighters for one slim young woman who hadn't said a word in 4 hours. Marcus thought the numbers were fine. Then the road bent around a sharp rock wall, and everything stopped being fine very quickly. The explosion that took out the front transport was not a big, cinematic fireball. It was a precise, professional strike, a shaped charge buried under the road surface that flipped the vehicle sideways with a sound like a thunderclap swallowed by the mountain. Before the dust from that had even settled, gunfire was already coming from 3 points on the ridgeline above. Coordinated. Planned. Someone had known exactly where the convoy would be and exactly when. Marcus was moving before his brain had fully processed what was happening. His body had been through enough ambushes to work on its own in the first seconds. Out, left side, use the vehicle as cover. He was already at the transport door, already pulling it open, already pushing his soldiers through. The Ketharan guards from the middle and rear sections were scrambling, some of them shouting in their own language, their coordination breaking down under the sudden shock of real fire. They trained for combat. Training and the real thing were different animals. The princess had not moved. Marcus turned back. Saravel was sitting exactly where she had been, both hands flat on her knees, staring at the open transport door with an expression that wasn't fear. It was something closer to a person who had never been in danger before and did not yet understand that they were in danger now. "Ma'am," Marcus said it simply, "we need to move." She looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time since the journey started. Then a shot cracked off the side of the transport 6 inches above her head, and she understood. She moved. The next 4 minutes were chaos. Marcus got Saravel behind the transport and kept his body between her and the ridgeline. His squad was doing their job, laying down suppressing fire, trying to identify shooter positions, keeping the enemy from pushing down the slope. The Ketharan guards were slowly getting organized, Reichsvoll's voice cutting through the noise as he took control of the defense from behind the wrecked front vehicle. Then things got worse. The Vrethkai Syndicate fighters, because it was the Syndicate, Marcus could tell from the weapons signatures and the way they moved, had a second squad coming from below the road, not the ridge. A pincer. Simple. Effective. The convoy's defensive line was facing the wrong direction for half the threat. The middle transport, their transport, was suddenly the most exposed position. The shooting from below was close. Too close. Marcus heard Reichsvoll's voice over the shared comm channel, heard the order being given in Ketharan, then translated a half-second later by the comm's auto-relay. Tactical withdrawal. Fall back to a defensible position 200 meters up the road. Regroup and call for air support. It was a reasonable order, militarily sound. Abandon the exposed middle position, consolidate forces, wait for backup. The problem was that the princess was in the exposed middle position, and the withdrawal route went away from her, not toward her. Marcus watched the Ketharan guards moving, following orders, falling back. He watched the Vrethkai squad below the road pushing up the slope toward the middle transport. 3 fighters, moving fast and low, already within 50 meters. He looked at Saravel, crouched behind the rear wheel of the transport. Her composed expression finally cracked, her large dark eyes wide and darting. He keyed his comm. "Corporal Diaz, take command, fall back with the Ketharan, do not wait for me." A pause, then Diaz's voice careful and controlled. "Sergeant." "You heard me," Marcus ended the channel. He checked his rifle. He counted the distance to the 3 approaching Vrethkai fighters. He looked once more at the princess, who was staring at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. He wasn't thinking about the political situation. He wasn't thinking about the orders from the convoy command or the strategic value of the withdrawal. He wasn't thinking about the gap between human soldiers and Ketharan royalty, or the fact that her own guards had just left her behind. He was thinking about one thing only. She was still alive. And for Marcus Hale, that was always reason enough. He stepped out from behind the transport, raised his rifle, and started walking toward the enemy. The first Vrethkai fighter saw Marcus coming and made the mistake of thinking it was funny. The Vrethkai were big. Not big the way humans meant when they used the word. They were big the way something built for violence is big, wide through the chest and shoulders, with 4 arms instead of 2 and a flat, armored face that showed almost no expression. They wore mismatched combat gear, scavenged from a dozen different species and conflicts, and they moved with the easy confidence of professionals who had done this kind of work for a long time. 3 of them against 1 human who was already walking toward them in the open. The first one raised his weapon but didn't fire immediately. He said something to the other 2 in Vrethkai, a guttural, clicking language, and both of them slowed down, as if they wanted to watch. Marcus shot the one who had stopped to make jokes first. Clean shot, center mass. The fighter dropped. The other two opened fire immediately. Marcus was already moving sideways, not backward, not into cover, sideways, keeping himself between the enemy and the transport behind him. One shot clipped his left shoulder. It burned. He felt the impact knock him half a step, but it didn't go through the armor plate, and he didn't stop moving. He closed the distance to the second fighter in 4 seconds, which the Vrethkai soldier clearly did not expect. At close range, the long alien rifle was a problem, too long to swing quickly in tight quarters. Marcus got inside the swing, used the barrel of his own rifle to pin the alien's upper arms down, and drove his elbow up hard into the fighter's face twice in quick succession. The Vrethkai went down. The third one got a shot off that hit Marcus in the side, below the armor plate. That one went through. Marcus took the hit. He felt it like a hot bar of metal sliding between his ribs, sharp and immediate. He breathed through it. He turned and fired 3 times at the third fighter, who was still trying to bring the weapon back up for a second shot, and didn't manage it. Then there was no more shooting. Marcus stood in the sudden quiet. The wind moved through the rocks above. Somewhere further up the road, there was still gunfire, Diaz and the others, the Ketharan Guard, the Vrethkai Ridge positions, but none of it was here anymore. Here it was just him, 3 downed fighters, and the ache in his side that was getting louder and more insistent every second. He walked back to the transport. Saravel was still behind the rear wheel, exactly where he had left her. She was watching him approach with an expression he had never seen on a Ketharan face before, because he had never been around Ketharan long enough to learn their expressions. He didn't know what it meant. He filed it away. "Can you walk?" he said. She stood up without answering, which he took as a yes. "There's a cave system in this ridge. I saw it on the topographic survey. We're going there." He said it as a statement, not a question. "Stay close, stay low, don't stop for anything." She looked at the 3 Vrethkai fighters on the ground. She looked at the blood coming through the lower side of his jacket. She looked at his face. "You are injured," she said. Her voice was low and precise. Her accent shaped the words strangely, like each one had been learned very carefully. "I know," Marcus said. "Walk." They walked. Getting to the caves took 40 minutes of hard terrain, moving through loose rock and narrow ledges while the sounds of the main firefight faded behind them. Marcus kept checking behind them. Nothing followed. The Vrethkai had other priorities right now. The main convoy was still fighting back, which meant the bulk of the syndicate force was occupied. The caves were deeper than the topographic survey had suggested, which was good. They went in far enough that the wind stopped and the temperature dropped, and the sounds from outside became a low, distant murmur. Marcus found a chamber with 2 entry points, important, because one entrance was a trap and 2 meant options, and stopped there. He put his back to the wall and sat down, which he had been wanting to do for the last 20 minutes. Saravel stood in the middle of the chamber and watched him with those unreadable dark eyes. "Sit down," Marcus said. "We're not going anywhere until it's dark and that firefight is over. You need medical attention." "I need to not bleed to death. There's a first aid kit in my pack. You're going to help me." She looked at him very steadily. "I am not trained in medical application." "Then you're going to learn." He pulled the pack off carefully, trying not to move his left side too much, and set it on the ground between them. "Come here." She came. She sat across from him and opened the pack when he told her to, found the field kit and listened as he quietly talked her through cleaning and packing the wound. She was precise. She didn't hesitate. She didn't make unnecessary sounds or movements. Once she understood what she was supposed to do, she did it exactly right, which Marcus respected. When it was done, he leaned his head back against the rock wall and breathed. "Why did you come back?" she said. He looked at her. She was sitting straight, hands in her lap, watching him. "What?" "My guard left. Commander Reichsfeld gave the retreat order. Your own unit followed it." She said it without accusation, without emotion, just as a series of facts. "You came back. Why?" Marcus thought about the question. It felt like a strange one to him, but he had learned enough about alien species to know that what felt obvious to a human wasn't always obvious to someone else. "Because you were still alive," he said. She waited as if expecting more. When no more came, she said, "That is the complete reason." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. In Ketharan military doctrine, the protection of one is weighed against the protection of many. Reichsvoll's decision was consistent with doctrine. "I know," Marcus said. "It was a reasonable call." "But you disagreed with it." "I didn't disagree with it." He shifted slightly, winced, settled. "I just didn't follow it." That seemed to confuse her more than a direct disagreement would have. She looked at him the way someone looks at a math problem that isn't giving the answer it should. They stayed in the cave through the rest of that day and through the night. Marcus slept in short intervals, waking often to check both entrances and listen to the sounds outside, which gradually went from gunfire to silence to the ordinary noises of a mountain at night. Saravel did not seem to sleep much. When Marcus woke in the small hours before dawn, she was sitting upright, watching the cave entrance, and she looked like she had been doing it for hours. "You should sleep," he said. "I find it difficult," she admitted, which sounded like a rare admission from her. "You're running on adrenaline, it'll crash." He looked at the entrance. "I'll watch, rest." She looked at him for a moment. Then, very carefully, she shifted her position against the cave wall and closed her eyes. He wasn't sure she would actually sleep, but within a few minutes her breathing changed, and she did. The second day was harder. Their water was limited and the Vrethkai were still moving through the area. Twice Marcus heard boots on rock above them, and both times he made a small gesture at Saravel, who had already gone completely still before his hand moved. She learned fast. She watched him and she adjusted, and she stopped asking questions when the situation required silence. By the second evening, she was asking different kinds of questions. "You told me humans feel fear the same way other species do," she said, during a quiet hour when the sounds outside had died away again. Marcus hadn't told her that. She had asked him about it while he was half awake, and he had apparently talked. He didn't remember exactly what he'd said. "More or less," he answered. "Then you were afraid when you walked toward those 3 fighters?" "Yes." "But you did it anyway." "Yes." She was quiet. Then, in Ketharan language there is a word velkith which means to act in the absence of fear. Courage. It is considered a high virtue, but what you are describing is something else. Acting in the presence of fear. She paused. "We do not have a word for that." Marcus looked at the cave ceiling. He thought about all the times in his life he had been afraid and kept moving anyway. He had never thought of it as unusual. He had thought of it as just the job. "Maybe you should get one," he said. On the third morning, the sounds of a search and rescue shuttle cut through the mountain air. Ketharan frequency. Marcus pulled a signal flare from his pack, looked at Saravel, and she nodded. They walked out of the caves into cold morning light, and the shuttle banked toward them across a pale green sky, and Marcus felt the wound in his side ache all the way through him, and he thought that this was probably over. He was wrong, it was just beginning. The royal court of the Ketharan Dominion was not a room that made you feel small by accident. Everything about it had been built, across many centuries and by many hands, to produce a single feeling in anyone who walked through the tall silver doors, that the people in this room mattered, and you did not. The ceiling rose 40 meters overhead. The floor was polished stone that caught the light and threw it back in cold patterns. The seats along the walls, where the assembled nobles and military commanders and diplomatic envoys sat, were arranged in a perfect half-circle that funneled every eye toward the single raised platform at the far end, where the throne sat. And on the throne sat Queen Velsura. She was old. That was the first thing you noticed. old in the way that ancient things are old, not diminished by it, but made stranger. Her face was still sharp, still geometric in the Catharan way, but the skin had gone from pale blue-gray to something closer to white, and her dark eyes had developed a depth in them that made people instinctively look away after too long. She sat straight. She always sat straight. She was 91 years old in Catharan years, which was close to 130 in human measurement, and she moved and spoke like someone who had spent every one of those years learning exactly how much each word cost. She had been told that her daughter was alive. That had been the first message, arriving 6 hours after the ambush on the Veilthas Prime Road. Her daughter was alive and unaccounted for. Then, 3 hours after that, a second message. Her daughter had been found and recovered in the company of one human soldier from the Terran Expeditionary Corps. The Queen had said nothing to either message. She had simply nodded and continued her scheduled day. But the court knew her. The court had watched her for decades, and the court noticed that she canceled 2 non-essential meetings that afternoon and sat in her private study for 3 hours alone. Now it was the following day, and the court was assembled, and Commander Reichsfeld was standing in the center of the polished floor, delivering his report on the ambush and its aftermath. He was good at this. He had a commanding voice and a steady posture, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who had never seriously questioned his own account of events. He described the ambush. He described the tactical situation. He described the decision to initiate a withdrawal to a defensive position, the correct call given the circumstances, the one that had preserved the majority of his guard force and allowed them to fight off the Vrethkai Ridge attack. He described coordinating the search for the princess. He described the eventual recovery. He did not mention Marcus Hale's name. He did not mention the 3 dead Vrethkai fighters between the abandoned transport and the cave entrance. He did not explain how Princess Saravel came to be in a mountain cave for 3 days with a wounded human soldier, rather than being recovered immediately. The Queen listened to all of it without moving. When Reichsfeld finished, there was a brief silence, the kind that a court full of political professionals instinctively fills with respectful murmuring and nodding. Then Saravel spoke. She had been sitting in the secondary seat to the left of the throne, the seat reserved for the member of the royal family present at court proceedings. She had been still and quiet through all of Reichsfeld's report. Several of the nobles had assumed she was simply tired from her ordeal, or perhaps shaken, or perhaps content to let the commander speak while she recovered. They had misjudged her considerably. "Commander Reichsfeld," she said, and her voice carried across the entire chamber without effort, left my position before any contact had been made with me. He did not coordinate a search. He withdrew his force and filed a request for aerial reconnaissance the following morning. The chamber went very quiet. Reichsfeld turned to look at her. His expression was controlled, but something shifted behind it. "Your Highness, the tactical situation required." "I am not finished," Saravel said. She stood up. She was taller than Marcus had realized, or perhaps it was just the room, or the way she held herself now compared to how she had sat in that transport. She walked down from the secondary seat to the center of the floor, the place where Reichsfeld had been standing, and he moved aside by instinct before he even processed that he was doing it. She spoke for 12 minutes. She spoke clearly, without raising her voice, without emotional display, with the systematic precision of someone laying stones in a wall, one fact at a time, in order, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. She described the ambush from her position. She described watching the Catharan guard withdraw. She described the 3 Vrethkai fighters closing on her position. Then she described Marcus Hale walking toward them. The court was not accustomed to being surprised. These were people who had spent careers learning not to show surprise. But there was a particular quality to the silence as Saravel described what she had watched from behind the wheel of that transport. The one human soldier, already bleeding, closing the distance to 3 Vrethkai fighters in the open, on purpose, because she was still alive, and he had apparently decided that was sufficient reason. She described the 3 days in the caves, the wound he had sustained, the way he had talked her through treating it, the way he had slept in short intervals and woken to check the entrances, the way he had watched through the dark hours so she could sleep. She described the conversation they had, the question she had asked him, the answer he had given. He said, Saravel told the assembled court of the Ketharan Dominion in the full silence of that 40-meter chamber, that he came back because I was still alive. That was the complete reason. She paused. I asked him twice. He had no other answer because for him there was no other answer. It was not a calculation. It was not a doctrine. It was simply what he did. She turned and looked at Reichsville, who had the rigid posture of someone standing very still because moving felt dangerous. The human soldier's name is Sergeant Marcus Hale, she said. He is currently recovering in a Terran field hospital on Vaelthas Prime. I would suggest the court learn his name, because I intend to ensure they do not forget it. She returned to her seat. The chamber started talking all at once. The Queen said nothing. She watched her daughter sit down, fold her hands in her lap, and look forward with the calm expression of someone who had said exactly what she meant to say and was prepared to sit quietly while the room caught up. For the first time in a long time, Queen Velsera allowed herself a feeling that was almost pride. Marcus, at that exact moment, was lying in a medical bay on Vaelthas Prime and arguing with a doctor. I don't need a second surgery, he said. The fragment is still in there, the doctor said, not looking up from his screen. The doctor was human, which meant this argument was conducted with the special exhaustion of 2 people from the same species who both thought they were right. I've had fragments in there before. That does not make it a good idea. It makes it a familiar idea. Corporal Diaz was sitting in the chair by the window, watching this exchange with the patient expression of someone who had watched Marcus argue with doctors before and knew how it ended. Sarge, she said, just let them take the fragment out. I'll think about it. His squad was intact. That was the thing he had needed to know first, before anything else, before asking about his own wound, before asking about the convoy, before asking anything. All 5 of his soldiers had come through the ambush. 2 had minor injuries. Everyone was walking. The Ketharan had not thanked them. That wasn't entirely surprising. The convoy operation was still being processed, reports were being filed, and the diplomatic machinery moved slowly. But there was also, Marcus suspected, the particular awkwardness of a situation where a Ketharan Royal Guard commander had retreated and a human auxiliary sergeant had not, and no one was quite sure yet how to address that gap in a politically comfortable way. He was thinking about this, and also thinking about the fragment in his side, and also watching the pale green sky through the medical bay window when the Ketharan envoy arrived. He heard them before he saw them. The door to the medical bay opened with more authority than doors usually opened with, and 2 Ketharan royal guards in formal dress armor came through first, followed by a slender diplomat in traveling robes carrying a small silver case. The doctor straightened up immediately. Diaz stood. The 2 other soldiers in the bay both went very still. Marcus looked at the envoy and said nothing. The diplomat crossed the room, opened the silver case, and removed a single sealed message. The seal was Ketharan royal wax. Marcus knew the color, dark blue-green, pressed with a mark he vaguely recognized from the briefing materials. Something high-ranked. Something from the palace. The diplomat held it out to him. From Her Majesty Queen Velsera of the Ketharan Dominion, the diplomat said, very precisely. For Sergeant Marcus Hale, personal. Marcus took it. He looked at it for a moment. He broke the seal and read the message. It was short, formal. In carefully translated standard, he read it twice. His face did not change while he read. His squad commander, who had walked in just as the envoy arrived and was watching from the doorway, later said that Marcus's expression during those few seconds was one of the most unreadable things she had ever seen on a human face. Marcus folded the letter. He folded it again. He put it in the breast pocket of his hospital gown with a care that seemed slightly out of place, given that he was wearing a hospital gown. His squad commander, Lieutenant Akafer, a tall woman with sharp eyes and no patience for vagueness, stepped fully into the room. "Sergeant Hale," she said carefully, "what does it say?" Marcus looked up. He looked at Akafer. He looked at Diaz. He looked at the Ketharan diplomat, who was waiting with the professional patience of someone who delivered royal messages regularly and was used to the various ways people reacted to them. Apparently, Marcus said, "I've been summoned." Lieutenant Akafer stared at him. "Summoned where?" Marcus looked back out at the pale green sky. "The homeworld," he said. Getting to Velkethas took 4 days. The Ketharan ship that came to collect Marcus was not a military vessel. It was something quieter and more expensive, the kind of ship that slid through space without announcing itself. The cabin they gave him was larger than his bunk at the base, which made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't fully explain. He spent most of the 4 days reading the briefing documents that Lieutenant Akafer had sent with him, learning about Ketharan court protocol, Ketharan customs, what to do with his hands, how to address the queen, when to speak and when not to. He read all of it. He found it useful. He was not sure any of it would actually matter once he was in the room, but it was better to know than not to know. He still had the fragment in his side. He had refused the second surgery. He was not going to meet an alien queen in a post-operative state if he could help it. Velkethas was beautiful in the way that very old, very powerful things are beautiful, not warmly, not in a way that invited you to relax, but in a way that made you feel the weight of everything it had seen. The planet was larger than Earth, with a gravity Marcus felt in his knees and his back from the first step off the ship. The sky was deep purple at midday. The capital city had been built over 2,000 years, and it looked at layer upon layer of architecture that had simply accumulated, each century's style pressing down on the one before it, the whole thing now vast and intricate and somehow coherent. He was given an escort of 6 Ketharan palace guards the moment he stepped off the ship, not his escort, their escort, guiding him to where he needed to be. He understood the difference and walked with them without complaint. The Terran diplomatic attaché, a nervous young man named Callum who had been scrambled to Velkethas in a panic when the summons became official, met Marcus at the palace gate and fell into step beside him, speaking quietly and quickly. "The situation is more politically sensitive than we initially understood," Callum said. "Most situations are," Marcus said. "There are noble factions in the court who feel the convoy incident reflects poorly on the Ketharan Guard. There are others who feel it reflects well on the human alliance, which they don't necessarily like. The Queen's intentions in summoning you are not fully clear to our diplomatic contacts. This could be a commendation. It could also be a way of managing the optics of Commander Reichsfell's decision. Is Reichsfell being held accountable?" Callum made a face that suggested the answer was complicated. "He's been temporarily relieved of command pending an internal review. Whether that leads anywhere depends on several factors." Marcus nodded. He was looking at the palace as they approached it. It was a serious building. He appreciated serious buildings. They were honest about what they were. He had been told to wear his dress uniform. He had done it, though the stiff collar was uncomfortable and the metal bar on his chest felt heavy. He had also, because he was Marcus Hale, checked that he could move freely in the uniform before he put it on. Old habit. Some habits didn't respect formal occasions. The Queen met him privately first. He had not expected that. He had expected to be walked directly into the formal court session. Instead, one of the senior palace attendants guided him down a side corridor, away from the main hall, and through a set of doors into a room that was smaller than the court chamber but still managed to feel large. High windows, shelves of what appeared to be physical texts, actual books, printed materials, a rare thing even on Velkethas, a wide desk that was very organized. And behind the desk, Queen Velsera. She looked older up close. More precisely, she looked realer. All the grandeur of the throne softened into the reality of a very old woman who was also, clearly, still very sharp. She was looking at him the same way Saravel had looked at him in the cave, which was to say with a directness and intensity that most humans reserved for looking at things they didn't entirely understand. "Sergeant Hale," she said, her standard was excellent, better than most of her court from what he'd seen. "Sit down." He sat. "I have read my daughter's account," she said. "I have also read your military record, which my staff compiled at my request." She folded her hands on the desk. "You have done this before, gone back for people. It is apparently a pattern." "Yes, ma'am." "Tell me why." He thought about how to say it simply. "Because leaving someone who's alive isn't the same as losing someone in a fight. It's a choice. I don't make that choice. Even when the military logic supports it." "The military logic is usually right," he said. "I just don't always agree with it." She was quiet for a moment, studying him. "My daughter says that when she asked you why you came back, you said it was because she was still alive, nothing more." "That's right. You did not think about the political value of protecting a royal life, the potential reward, the military consequences of disobeying the withdrawal order." "I thought about all of those things later," Marcus said honestly. "In the moment, I just knew she was alive and the threat was there and I had a rifle." The Queen looked at him for a long time. Long enough that Marcus, who was not easily made uncomfortable, became slightly uncomfortable. "You are a very strange kind of creature, Sergeant Hale," she said at last. "I've been told," he said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. He thought it might have been the Ketharan equivalent of a smile, though he wasn't sure. "Come," she said, standing. "The court is waiting." The court was waiting. Marcus walked into the chamber behind the Queen, which was not how he had been briefed to enter. He had been briefed to enter separately, from a side door, stand in the designated space, receive the Queen's commendation, nod, and leave. But the Queen had simply walked through the main doors and kept moving, and Marcus had followed her because that seemed like the correct thing to do, and now he was standing in the center of the floor in his dress uniform with what felt like 300 Ketharan eyes on him. The court was fuller than he expected. Word had gotten around, apparently. Nobles and commanders and attachés who had perhaps not planned to attend this session had found their way in. Callum was somewhere in the crowd, Marcus assumed, probably sweating. The formal part went smoothly. The Queen spoke from the throne in Ketharan, her words translated through the court's audio relay into standard for his benefit. She described the events on Velkethas Prime. She acknowledged the failure of the Royal Guard and the formal action being taken against Reichsfall. She acknowledged the role of the Terran Expeditionary Corps Auxiliary, Marcus's squad, in holding their position during the initial phase of the ambush. Then she spoke about Marcus specifically. She used simple, direct language. He came back when he was not ordered to. He held a position others had left. He kept her daughter safe for 3 days in hostile terrain while injured. The court listened. No one spoke. Then the Queen said, "Princess Saravel has requested permission to address the court." Saravel stood from the secondary seat. She was dressed formally today, robes that were deep blue, the color of the royal family, with silver at the cuffs and collar. She looked different than she had in the cave. She looked like a princess. But her eyes, when they found Marcus across the chamber, were the same eyes, direct, certain, not performing anything for anyone. She walked to the center of the floor. She stopped in front of Marcus. She was tall enough that they were almost level, looking at each other. Then she did something that Marcus did not understand. She took his right hand in both of hers. Her hands were cool and her grip was firm. She began speaking in Ketharan, the old form of it from what he could tell, slow and formal, different from ordinary speech. The audio relay tried to translate and produced only fragments: bond, protection, equal, claimed, house, champion. The court, which had been quiet before, became absolutely silent, a different kind of silence, a silence that had weight in it. Saravel finished speaking. She held his hand for a moment longer, looking at him steadily. Then she stepped back. The chamber erupted. Not in applause. In noise, voices, many of them at once, high and sharp, the sound of a room full of politicians encountering something they had no prepared response for. Several nobles were on their feet. Someone near the back was speaking very loudly and very quickly to someone else. At least 3 attachés were relaying messages on handheld devices. Marcus stood in the center of it, in his dress uniform, with no idea what had just happened. A palace attendant appeared at his elbow. "Sergeant Hale," the attendant said, low and careful. "Perhaps step to the side while the court responds." Marcus stepped to the side. Callum appeared from somewhere in the crowd, white-faced and wide-eyed. He grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him toward the chamber wall. "Do you understand what just happened?" he hissed. Marcus looked across the room at Saravel, who had returned to the secondary seat and was sitting with perfect calm, watching the chaos she had created with an expression of complete composure. She met his eyes for a moment. She did not look like someone who had made a mistake. He looked back at Callum. "I'm starting to," he said. Callum made a sound like a man who needed to sit down. "She performed the Velkatha. It's ancient. It's a royal claiming right. It hasn't been performed in generations. It's a bond between a royal and their chosen champion, not as a servant, not as a guard, as an equal." He looked at Marcus with an expression that was somewhere between astonishment and pure diplomatic panic. "She just claimed you, in front of the entire court. Under the old law, it's considered binding." Marcus looked at Saravel again. She was still watching him, still calm, still certain. He thought about the cave, about 3 days in the cold dark, talking through the night, about the question she had asked him twice, and the answer he had given twice because there was only one answer. "Okay," he said. Callum stared at him. "Okay. What do you need me to do right now?" Nothing. The court is responding. The Queen needs to rule on whether the Velkatha stands. There are going to be formal objections. This is going to take." "Then tell me when there's something for me to do," Marcus said. He leaned against the wall and folded his arms. His side ached. He probably should have gotten that surgery. He watched the storm he hadn't caused but had apparently walked into. And he thought that, for a man who had expected a commendation and an early flight home, his day had taken a fairly significant turn. The formal objection came the next morning. It was presented by Lord Vetharan, a senior noble of the Ketharan Dominion's oldest family, delivered in writing to the palace court office before the sun had fully risen over the capital. It was 40 pages long, densely argued, and cited precedents going back 400 years. The core argument was simple even if the document was not. The Velkatha required the chosen champion to be capable of fulfilling the duties of a royal protector under Ketharan law. A human being could not fulfill those duties. Therefore, the right was invalid and the court should declare it void. Marcus received a summary of the objection from Callum over breakfast. He read it. He ate his food. He asked 2 questions about Ketharan inheritance law, which Callum answered as best he could. Then Marcus said he was going to take a walk. Callum asked if that was a good idea given the political situation. Marcus said the walk was not for the political situation. It was because he had been sitting still for too long, and his side was stiffening. He walked. The palace had outdoor sections, high, open corridors that ran along the outer walls and looked over the capital below and the purple sky above. Marcus walked slowly, which he hated, but the wound insisted. He was thinking about the objection. He was also thinking about Saravel, and about the conversation he needed to have with her that no one had allowed him to have yet. Because, since the court session the previous afternoon, there had been a constant stream of attendants and diplomats and protocol officials moving him from place to place like a piece on a board. He needed to talk to her, not about the politics, about what she actually meant. She found him before he found her. She came around a corner of the upper corridor alone, which surprised him. He had not seen her without at least 2 attendants since arriving at the palace. She was dressed more simply today, closer to the traveling clothes from the convoy, and she looked, if possible, even more composed than she had in the court chamber. "I assumed you would be here," she said. "You don't like being inside for too long." "You picked that up in 3 days," he said. I paid attention. She came to stand beside him at the corridor's edge, looking out over the city. "You have questions?" "One main one," Marcus said. She waited. "What do you actually want from this?" he said. He kept his voice level and his words plain, the same way he had spoken to her in the cave. No diplomatic dressing, no careful language. Not what the right means legally, not what the court says about it, what you mean by it. Saravel was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the same quality it had in the cave, the careful quality of someone translating an honest thought into honest words. "In the Ketharan tradition," she said, "the Velkatha was performed when a royal found someone whose value could not be expressed through ordinary rank or title. Not a servant because servants are below. Not an ally because allies are separate. An equal who chose to stand beside you anyway." She paused. "When I watched you walk toward those fighters, I was afraid. I believed I was going to die. And then you were there, and the fear did not go away, but something else came with it. The knowledge that you had decided I was worth going back for, without calculation, without reward, simply because I was there." She turned to look at him. "In my life, every person who has stood beside me has done so because of what I am, my title, my house, my connection to the throne. You did not know what those things were worth to you. You came back before you had time to calculate anything at all." She looked back at the city. "I have never had that before. I did not want to lose it." Marcus was quiet for a while. "The right binds a champion to the royal house," he said finally. "The legal definitions around it, what would that mean practically? For my service, my core." "The legal matters are being negotiated," she said. "My mother is aware that a solution must account for your obligations to your own people. That is not a small thing to arrange, but it is not impossible." A pause. "My mother is better at arrangements than people generally understand." "I got that impression," Marcus said. Saravel glanced at him sideways. "She said you were a strange kind of creature." "She told you that?" "She tells me most things." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "She also said that she had not met anyone in 30 years who made her ask a question she could not immediately answer." Marcus looked out at the capital. Purple sky. Ancient buildings stacked on older buildings stacked on older ones. A civilization that had been watching the stars while humans were still learning to write. "What was the question?" he said. "Why did he come back?" Saravel said simply. The formal council session to rule on Lord Vetharan's objection was held 3 days later. It was a smaller gathering than the full court. The senior noble council, 12 members, seated in a circular chamber below the main hall. The queen presided. Saravel sat to her left. Marcus sat to the side, behind the Terran diplomatic section, with Callum beside him radiating tension. Lord Vetharan was tall, gray at the edges of his Ketharan blue-gray skin, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had won many arguments in rooms like this. He had representation, 2 secondary nobles and a legal advocate, and his presentation was thorough and controlled. He cited the requirements of the Velkatha champion in detail. Physical standards. Lifespan requirements. A Ketharan champion was expected to serve for decades, and humans lived shorter lives. Species requirements. implied though not explicitly stated in the original text, which he argued could be inferred from the cultural context of its creation. He built his case carefully. He was good at it. When he finished, the council chair invited responses. 2 of the 12 council members immediately indicated they had questions. Another indicated support for the objection. Then Saravel raised her hand. The council chair paused. The standing of the princess to speak in a council session rather than a full court session was technically irregular. The chair looked at the queen. The queen made a small gesture. The chair nodded. "Princess Saravel," the chair said, "the council acknowledges you." Saravel stood. She looked at Lord Vetherin. She looked at the 12 council members. She looked at her hands for a moment as if gathering something, and then she looked up. "Lord Vetherin has argued," she said, "that Sergeant Hale cannot fulfill the duties of the Velkatha champion because he does not meet the required standards." She paused. "I would like to ask the council a single question, not a legal question, a factual one." The council chair waited. "Name one of your champions," Saravel said, "who went back." The chamber was very quiet. "Name one Ketharan soldier in this convoy, in this escort, in any unit attached to my detail, who turned around when the withdrawal order was given." She looked at Lord Vetherin directly. "Name one person who walked toward the fighters closing on my position." "Name one person who carried me through 3 days in a mountain cave while bleeding from a wound that required surgery, who stayed awake through the night so I could sleep, who asked for nothing and calculated nothing, and simply decided that as long as I was alive there was no other option." She looked at the council. "If you can name that person, then I will consider the objection. If you cannot, then I ask you what standard, exactly, Sergeant Hale has failed to meet." Lord Vetherin said nothing. The council was silent. Saravel sat down. Queen Velsera spoke. She spoke briefly and without drama. She had considered the legal arguments. She had considered the precedents. She had also considered the facts. The Velkatha under the old law was the ruling authority of the choosing party, and the choosing party was a princess of full standing. The rite had been performed correctly. The objection was noted and formally rejected. The Velkatha stood. Lord Vetherin gathered his materials and left without speaking. Several of his allies followed. 3 of the council members who had seemed uncertain were now watching Marcus with expressions he had seen on alien faces before, in his career. The specific look of a species encountering something they had underestimated and were revising their understanding of in real time. Callum let out a very long, very controlled breath beside him. "That's it," he said quietly. "It's done. It stands." Marcus nodded. He was watching Saravel, who was speaking quietly with the queen, her head bent slightly toward her mother, some private exchange that the council chamber gave them space for. "What does the Terran Corps say?" Marcus asked. "They're still deciding," Callum said carefully. "There's no existing protocol for this. It's being evaluated at levels considerably above my pay grade." He glanced at Marcus. "How do you feel about it?" Marcus thought about the question seriously, the way he thought about most questions seriously. He thought about the mountain road, the cave, the 3 days of cold and dark and quiet conversation, the moment in the upper corridor when she had said, "I did not want to lose it," with the same plain honesty he used when he talked about why he came back. "I think," Marcus said, "it's going to require some arrangement." That's a very measured response. I'm a measured person. That evening, the formal reception was held in the main hall, a smaller, less formal version of the court session, with food and movement and conversation instead of ceremony. Marcus stood near the window with a drink he was not entirely sure was safe for human biology, and watched the palace light go amber as the sun dropped. Saravel found him there, as she had on the upper corridor. She stood beside him and looked out at the same sky. The twin moons of Velkethas were rising, 2 pale shapes climbing above the city's old rooftops, their light cool and blue-white. The Vrethkai Syndicate released a statement, she said. They called the Velkatha proof that the Dominion has weakened, that binding a human as a royal champion shows desperation. What does your mother say to that? She has not yet responded. A pause. She is still deciding what response would cost them the most. Smart woman, Marcus said. She is the smartest person I have ever met. Saravel was quiet for a moment. Until recently, she was also the most precise thinker about other people's decisions. She says you confused her. I know, she told me. Saravel glanced at him. She told you that directly. She said I was a strange kind of creature. I assumed that was the same thing. Something in Saravel's expression changed, softened maybe, in the way that faces soften when something genuinely unexpected happens. She looked at the moons. She was quiet for a comfortable stretch of time. There will be more challenges, she said. The noble factions do not give up easily. There will be political pressure. People who attempt to use you as a way to get to me, or use me as a way to get to you. The arrangement between our people will require time and careful work. I know, Marcus said. He had read enough briefing documents in 4 days to understand the shape of it. You are not concerned. He thought about it. I'm used to complicated situations, he said, and I'm used to seeing them through. She nodded slowly. She looked at the moons again. He looked at them too. 2 pale lights over a civilization that had been old when his world was young. A planet he had never expected to stand on, in a hall he had never expected to enter, beside a woman who had looked at everything he was, the plain, worn, stubborn, uncalculating thing that he was, and decided it was worth keeping. The galaxy was a strange place. He had always known that. He had spent his whole career walking into the strange parts of it with a rifle and a first aid kit, and the simple certainty that if someone was still alive, you went back for them. He had not expected that certainty to bring him here. But he was here. And Marcus Hale had a long history of seeing things through. Below the palace, the ancient city of Velkethas went quiet as the twin moons rose higher. The stars came out one by one over a world that had, in the last week, learned something it had not known before about the small, stubborn, short-lived species from a blue planet far away. They went back.